afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In continuation with the series on sociology of kinship, in today's lecture we're going to discuss on the feminist perspective for the study of family. So we were trying to understand the whole idea that industrialization, capitalism and economic transformation has impacted the family. Now there was a kind of an argument that the family was in crisis in terms of the dependence on wage earning, which was more individualistic, and this transition from collective production to individual earnings and consumption also impacted the gender relations in the family. So there was a requirement to understand family in order to provide a solution to the crisis. Now, a lot of feminist rethinking started taking place in the 1980s onwards, and the thinking about the family was kind of argued that was politically motivated. And many of the feminists were of opinion that there was a bias in the study of family, and the bias was through the evidence, as much of the literature or much of the study was done by men per se. So therefore, the orientation or the decline was towards the male perspective. Rethinking by feminists spurred by the kind of lot of change taking place, and some of the changes which were kind of very central to understand institutions of family was the increased rate of divorce, increased rate of illiteracy, increase in violence within family, increase in crime in the society, the increase of preferred hetero and homosexual cohabitation, communal and single parenthood. So a lot of changes was kind of visible within the institution of family. Now this was leading to a kind of change in the family structure, and some of the crisis was related to the problems of illiteracy, violence and crime. Many feminists argued that there was kind of revisiting some of the assumptions that had been central to the understanding of family as an institution. And one of the assumptions was that the rise of married women involvement in the paid or public sector was responsible for increase in crime and violence. It was a kind of an assumption that since women were earlier in the four domains of the house, they were taking more part in caring and socialization, and the shift to the paid labor had kind of reduced this activity and therefore the result in crime. Feminist sociologists and anthropologists tried to correct this assumption. The assumption that employment of married women in paid job disturbs the family has been strongly critiqued by a number of feminists. Studies have shown that married women take job either to improve the family's living standard or to prevent it from falling. Again, in a lot of gender studies, we see that it has been kind of evident that much of the paid employment of women is mainly a class-based phenomena. That is, women from the lower class and the class where the income is uncertain are into the paid job. As soon as the income of the family increases, many women withdraw from the paid employment. This kind of an assumption is possible only if we see the family as the core of the family. So prior to the coming in of the feminist, the family as an institution was perceived from a male perspective, and the women were an add-on. So now if you kind of reverse this and from a feminist perspective try to understand women as the core, and therefore the idea of negating the assumption that paid employment necessarily creates a crisis would have to be re-examined. The second assumption is that the contemporary women's movement was destroying the family. This was a kind of very commonsensical idea that the involvement of women in the women's movement, which was labeled as coming in from the West, was kind of creating radical attitudes and ideas, or they were kind of enabling women to question, to critique, and that was kind of negative for the family. This assumption is historically wrong, as the breakdown of their family is much older than the beginning of the women's movement. So the breakdown or the crisis in the family did not happen after the emergence of women movement. It is much older. And when we look into this assumption, we see that contrary to the increase in women's employment and in women's felt double burden of paid and unpaid work, has helped create a mass women's movement. So it was even before the women's movement started that there was a whole idea of women getting more marginalized or more victimized because of the double burden of the paid work as well as the unpaid work. And this was why, because the gender role within the domestic sphere was almost kind of static, and there was kind of no role reversal in the men performing the private job, and therefore the idea of double burden. So one result has been the women studying the family themselves. A lot of dimension to the function and structure of the family has been contributed by feminist researchers. Most of them provide corrective to the earlier work, and therefore the feminist method for the study of family becomes significant. There is not only a redefinition but also a change in the research methods to study family. Female informants started getting included as respondent in survey of own and alien culture. So prior to the feminist method, the researcher was a man as well as the respondents were male, because the opinion, the ideas of women were considered as insignificant. Earlier, when majority of the researchers were male anthropologists, the tendency was to ignore women respondent. The subject experience of power relation are weighed against the objective measure of relative power. Women's contribution to and consumption in the family and economy are individually factored out. The sociology of knowledge has been redefined by feminists to include gender perspective. And the gender perspective implies that the most feminist contribution has been to view women as individual within family rather than as a mere component. So the agency and the autonomy of the women becomes significant rather than just looking at women as add-on. So looking into how family will be studied, it is automatically the women's opinion has been studied, was critiqued, and the involvement of women as respondent and the subjective experience of women in the experience of structured inequality became the focus of feminist research. To view women as person involved in familiar and non-familiar relation was the subject of analysis by feminist researchers. From a feminist perspective, things appeared different. And what were the differences? Number one, the activities of other family members. So it was not only to look into what the main male members' activity was doing, but also look into the activities of all the dependent members. The second was the relationship to one another. Third, the distribution of goods and power and the struggle over both. So family was kind of a platform where power relation was being distributed. So it was kind of a doing away with the idea that power belonged to the public domain. Even the gender relation between a man and a woman was like a political power relation, and that had to be understood from the perspective of women themselves. The fourth difference was the socialization that produced gender-specific behavior. So much of the functionalist approach to family could kind of went by the assumption that socialization kind of taught people to carry on the norms. It kind of told you to learn the norms, which was kind of part of the family or part of the culture. Now, it was very important to understand this process of socialization because it was re-strengthening certain gender stereotypes and certain kind of assumptions. Feminists have opened a whole new vista by asking not what do women do for the family, an older question, what does the family do for women? What it does to women? So this question is completely reversed. So earlier study on family was trying to see the contribution that women were doing because the family as an institution was visualized as a comfort zone, and the women were getting protection, were getting care from it. So it was her responsibility to give back. Now feminists are saying, what has the family done? Let's not kind of go by the assumption that family is functional or it is kind of a place of cooperation. And so let's try to understand what it does for women and how it is kind of contributing for the women per se. So whom does the family organization serve best and how is another question arising from feminist rethinking. The feminist rethinking takes us back to the basic. What is family and what does it do? A major challenge has been posed by Rainer Rapp, an anthropologist, reviewing the variety of kin and household organization in human society. Rainer Rapp argues that academicians have overtly reified the family, making of it a thing, a biologically given, and thus confusing about its norms and deviation, changing structures and function. So the whole idea was that you have kind of studied family with a kind of an assumption that what it is given, it is natural, and our task is to kind of carry forward with the norms and values. There was an absence of critical thinking in terms of who are the members, what are the roles, how the changing structures are being impacted. Rainer Rapp further argues that there is a need to differentiate families from household. And when we see the difference between family and household, a household is a unit where members pool their resources for certain tasks, exhibit relation with larger domain, and effective reproduce society, especially class stratified society. So household was actually the functional unit where non-kin members could also be doing, and they had a common objective and all would work together for meeting that common objective. Rainer Rapp argues that the family might be more useful understood as mere concept, a social definition of who should be living together inside a household. Family becomes an aspect of ideology or normative thinking. When we look into the idea of family, what comes into mind is the idea of the relationship between social class and family. In Western civilization, family thus becomes a form of recruitment into household, which themselves are organized and according to social class. So the peasant families are different from those of wage earners. So the family is kind of related to the concept of class. We see a class difference when we try to understand family. So family is not uniform and universal a concept. The peasant family would be different from the wage earner, or we look into the aristocratic family, because the social structure within these class would be different and the participation of different members would also be different. People born into a household of certain type and thus find themselves in different families, dyadic, nuclear, extended, inclusive of non-kin and exclusive of non-kin. So therefore the idea that there is no one type of, there could be a variation, and this variation is dependent on the class and the income and also the participation of man and women in the household. another feminist rethinking, when we try to understand how family has been subject to studied by feminist anthropologists and sociologists, is to look into the concept of mothering. So mothering is kind of problematized by feminist rethinking because it's one of the kind of important role which has been assigned to women. Mothering is biologically based in childbearing and lactation, phenomena which is also temporary and geographically varied. So it is kind of again go by a biological determinist approach, then there is kind of only one way of looking at it in terms of a biological process of child rearing. But when we bring in the cultural specificity, we see that every culture has kind of a different set of norms and a different kind of ways in which the process of mothering is understood. One form of mothering is to understand it in a historical specific manner, and that is to understand the phenomena in a industrial advanced capitalist society. And this process in a advanced capitalist society idealizes motherhood, and therefore it kind of leaves behind the other forms of mothering. This occurred with the separation of home and work. So the capitalist society, with the value loaded to motherhood, created this dichotomy between the public and the domestic domain, the difference between the home and the work. So industrialization created two domains. One was the domestic space for reproduction, and the other the public space for production. So these two spheres, the private sphere belonged to the women and children, and the public sphere, including economy and politics, was ruled by men. Motherhood was constructed around the universal qualities of nurturance and self-sacrifice, appropriated mainly by European and American bourgeois. This started changing in the late 19th century and the entry of women in the labor force. With the entry of women in the labor force, the private public translated into a double burden of paid and unpaid work, an erosion of motherhood as a full-time, undiluted, natural vocation. For the feminist, other forms of parenting exist appropriate to other material conditions. So what was kind of showed as part of European and American context of motherhood in terms of the divide between the private and the public domain, the creation of double burden, was not necessarily again happening in other non-Western society. Other society, in terms of the material relations of productions, other forms of motherhood and their marginalization would have been possible. So what was the mothering in non-Western society? Non-Western, non-capitalist make child rearing central, either than marginal, and share it with kin other than the biological mother by non-kin in different ways. In industrial society, by custom, and in socialist society, by planning. In such societies, there is the possibility of being mother without falling into motherhood, and the other potential of women become realizable when they are less defined by their biological capacities. Feminist rethinking has allowed to look back at reproduction differently. So when we look into the feminist rethinking and redefinition, we try to understand the two approach of looking into the gender and understanding gender as a concept. The first approach is the biological determinist approach. Now, biological determinism refers to the idea that all human behaviors is innate, determined by the biology or by the genetic makeup, the brain size or other biological attributes. So commonsensically, we have heard a lot of time people saying that girls have less IQ because the brain size is long. But this is an assumption. This is a taken for granted assumption in order to differentiate between the boy and the girl. This theory, that is the theory of biological determinism, stands in contrast to the notion that human behavior is determined by culture or other social forces. So the IQ level of either a boy or a girl would depend to a large extent on the cultural upbringing of the child rather than going by the biological or the physiological construct. Inherent to biological determinism is the denial of free will. Individuals have no internal control over their behavior and disposition, and thus are devoid of responsibility for their action. Human behavior is associated only with biology, which is attributed as natural. So you go by the understanding that because biologically you are born as a woman, you are inferior, and therefore there is no critical thinking, no question of free will. One of the theorists or psychologists who kind of supported the biological determinist was Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud believed that women's biology determined their psychological makeup and therefore their abilities and roles. Sigmund Freud stated that anatomy is destiny. That is, if you are born as a woman, you would kind of be given a role which is inferior to the men. Sigmund Freud's normal human was a male and a female was a deviant human being whose entire psychological structure supposedly centered around the struggle to compensate for this deficiency. So it was kind of assumed that women were born with less capabilities and kind of therefore were deviant, and they had to kind of struggle to come out of this deficiency. When we look into the another approach, which is the cultural construction of gender, where feminists have kind of strongly critiqued the biological determinism, and the study of gender shifts from biological determinism to social construction and cultural specificity. Gail Rubin uses the phrase sex-gender system in order to describe a set of arrangement by which biological raw material of human sex and procreation is shaped by human social intervention. The aim is to create a genderless society in which one's sexual anatomy is irrelevant to what one is. So we assign a meaning to the biological organ, and after we assign a meaning, the role definition, the responsibility and status comes in. So it is a cultural construction rather than a biological kind of thing. Nancy Chodorow was another critique of Freud's biological determinist theory. She holds that gender is a matter of having feminine and masculine personalities that develop in early infancy as response to prevalent parenting practices. Childhood gender socialization further builds on and produces feminine and masculine persons. Similarly, we also have the critique of biological determinist by Marxist feminists, for whom the material transformation are responsible for the unequal gender relation. So when we were to conclude, we see that the feminist perspective has brought about a changing and reopened the question of what the family is, what members do, and how they are affected by the composition of the household. And this has been done by asking the fundamental question, what does the family do for women, rather than asking what women do for the family. So this answer to this big question will help us alter our understanding about the institution of family. To understand feminist contribution to understanding family, the most important reference from where the lecture has referred to is Renate B. The title of the book is The Family, A View from Room of Our Own, in Barrier Thorne and Marilyn Yalom, Rethinking the Family, Some Feminist Question, published in 1982. With this, I come to an end of today's lecture. Thank you.